Hi there. It might be weird to have a value investor talk about biotech, except for the fact that despite the billions that are pouring into the industry, they're really only going after the large, flashy objects. And there's a massive portion of the industry that's systematically underfunded. Because these large checks are looking for hundreds of millions of dollars of tickets, and there's a large portion of the industry, the biggest part of the industry actually, that only requires $500,000, $1 million, that is actually systematically ignored by all this big capital. We had the good fortune of having Dan Gold, the CEO of MEI Pharma, at our Investor Day this past September. And we talked about how the company's strategy of getting a drug from the 2% commercial chance of commercial success to a 30% chance of commercial success, they generally only spend around $10 million to do that. That's starkly contrasted to other companies that'll spend $50, $100 million on trial just to get it from a 30% chance of commercial success to an 80% chance of commercial success. In addition, this 2 to 30% portion of the market is systematically underfunded and has so many targets for a value investor to sift through. And so we had a philosophical conversation with Dan about the company's funding strategy, which I think has a lot of investing parallels as well. They're sifting through hundreds of drugs a year, we're sifting through hundreds of stocks a year, and they're going where the competition is low. So I hope you really enjoy this conversation with Dan Gold.
The Builders is a book that I'm writing and a white paper that's coming out. Common attributes is that the builders are contrarian, they're concentrated, and they're highly convicted. Dan, you might recognize these people actually. It's very rare that you would see a biotech CEO in a value investing crowd. But these two gentlemen, Dr. Miller and Bob Duggan, are going in the book, and I actually do think that they're builders. They turned pharmacyclics in from a pretty much a net nothing. Bob Duggan wrote it from $11 to 80 cents, and Miller was the one that actually licensed Imbruvica from a company that thought it was actually worthless. So they turned $2 million into $21 billion. Bob was the CEO throughout that time. They wrote it from 80 cents to 261. And Bob received a 61X. So we have the author of the 100 Baggers in the room, so everything's going to be done in X's today. And believe it or not, that wasn't their first hat trick. Miller was co-founder of IDEC, which became Biogen IDEC, and Duggan actually was co-founder of Computer Motion, which turned into Intuitive Surgical. The largest shareholder of Intuitive Surgical was in the room, and Bob's position was about the same size. Way back in the day, but he rolled that into pharmacyclics. This is Biogen IDEC. It took $860 million of invested capital, turned it into 38 today, or that stake was 38 today. And Duggan Computer Motion, that stake, which they in total invested capital of 112, went into 11 billion. I think Dan is the most interesting, MEI Pharma is the most interesting biotech company I've ever found, actually. And Dan is a very odd CEO for a small cap. Basically, you were net when we discovered you. Bob Mass is the chief medical officer. He was head of the teams that discovered probably the three most impactful cancer drugs in the last 2 decades. And I'd like to invite Dan up, and we'll have a quick chat. Thank you for being here, Dan. I wanted to give like a 1,000-foot view of the industry and talk about where MEI fits with the value creation life cycle of drugs. And so, particularly because phase 1, phase 2 is generally very underfunded in biotech space. So I guess I'm wondering, have you seen any changes in funding availability in the company's edge in getting stuff from lab into patients over the last 5 years, or essentially?
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. To be talked with Bob Duggan is quite an honor. So I think in general, there's been a monumental change in the industry. Getting a drug from the bench into phase 1, phase 2 was, at least in part, was the task of venture capital. And the goal was to give the company enough proof of concept, company would be sold or go IPO. That was the exit. No longer. VCs, they don't invest for an IPO as an exit because That isn't how the industry is working anymore. In fact, most of the successful IPOs in biotech, the insiders have to put in at least half to get the IPO funded.
Yeah.
So that is a monumental change. The other thing I think we've seen fairly recently, both on the private side and the public side, is there's been a lot of M&A over the last 5-10 years in biotech. And so the amount of money that's available for investment is huge right now. And so you're seeing big gambles. You'll see an A round or a B round of $100, $120 million. It's not unusual. It used to be, when I started a company in 2000, I think our seed round was $5 million, something like that.
Yeah.
And so that is a monumental change.
Is that capital less available for little tickets now? Because everyone wants SoftBank's unicorns, right?
Right. So that is the issue. It's the I hate to say it because I'm in the industry, but I think that there is a lot of what I call just lemmings. That the investment community, they latch on to a really good idea. Right now, the really good idea that everybody is investing in is cellular therapy and gene therapy.
Yeah.
And witness CRISPR. So CRISPR is this, I believe this is a monumental, this is up with PCR. When PCR occurred, that just changed the industry completely. That's how we find and sequence DNA back many years ago. Now, CRISPR, I think, is that next revolution in science. That you have 3 or 4 companies, public companies, that have never once treated a patient, not even close to treating a patient, with a cumulative market value of billions of dollars, literally billions of dollars. So
that's
big ideas are getting funded, public and private.
It's interesting. We've talked about how there's a dearth of people of funding willing to do a $5 million trial that creates the value of proving that concept, right?
Right.
And so has that actually not gotten better with the amount of liquidity available?
I think if you're not if you're not standing under that street light with everybody shining on you, it's very, very hard. It's very hard.
So what do you do? I mean, like your investors, we've been a long-term partner for you. We've been buying actually the last few weeks. But your investors have pretty much refused to fund this. So what do you do when you have 4 potentially billion-dollar drugs and the market says you're a net? You're just worth the cash on your balance sheet.
Right. So again, I think it's one, the nature of what you're trying to do. We take, you mentioned Bob Mass. Bob is, to me, is the premier clinical trialist in the United States, bar none. And so with our portfolio, we have 4 drugs in the clinic. We take a very, very hard look at how do you create evidence that people are going to really believe in and really buy into. And so we try and be smart on how to minimize the cost and maximize the evidence base. And hopefully you get to a point of proof of concept where you can attract either a partner, or last year we did large financing. For us, it was a very large financing. Nowadays it was nothing, but for us it was a very large financing, and it was because we were out there talking about it. We had this data, and I got a call from a couple of VCs, crossovers, who said, we think you're the best in class, and we want to invest. So they went under the hood, and they liked it, and they wanted it. So I think it is hard, and you just have to be very, I wouldn't say frugal, but you just have to be very efficient in your use of capital to get to an inflection.
I mean, before you started running your phase 1B on 401, which is a PI3 delta inhibitor, we were talking about what indication it would be most likely to get a partner, essentially. So 3 years ago, you were thinking about your exit, not your exit, but your funding mechanism on 401.
Right.
And so for you to talk publicly, not here, on your earnings call about, hey, we're going to we want to partner this.
Yeah.
You must have had, this must have turned some heads. You've got an 80% response rate versus the peers.
40 to 50.
Right, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
So how do you balance, if you do a partnership, you dilute the asset. Right. If you do a stock offering, you dilute the stock. How do you balance those two?
Yeah, it's the eternal question we constantly are asking ourselves internally. I've always said that in science or in biotech, in industry, our industry, you really have to do what you know how to do best. We know how to develop drugs. So we've been fortunate, as you said, we have 4 drugs in the clinic. The odds are that when you find a drug, the odds are 95% it's going to fail, full stop, in oncology or pretty much any industry. We're fortunate we have 4 drugs, 2 of them are in the last stages of development before approval, and we think both of them have a very high likelihood of approval, but time will tell. So we've, at least so far, we're above the curve. But that's what we know how to do. We don't know how to market a drug. And so what we did with our first drug is we gave a license, worldwide license, and we took that money, and we have $500 million in milestones that come in if that hits, and we took the upfront payment and we poured it into this drug because we had a lot of conviction. And with this drug we said, well, let's get it to an inflection point. We're not going to give it away because I don't think that is a good value generation for shareholders. I don't think we can constantly hope that we're going to find assets and be able to continue to turn them.
Right.
So,
although you've had a decent track record. I mean, you're sifting through hundreds all the time, right? It's just like us with stocks.
Exactly, exactly. But the odds are against us. So what we've said, and what we said on the earnings call, is we'd like to start to learn how to market a product because that's really where the value is. If you're selling your drug. But we certainly don't know how to do this in Europe. We don't know how to do it in Japan. So we did a Japanese partnership. And so what we'd like to do is get a very good partner. In cancer, everything is very competitive. Everybody's going after everything. So you want a good partner, and we want a seat at the table. We want some co-development rights. And then we'll learn. And then the next drug, hopefully, Berusiclib, we can do it ourselves. And that's sort of how we balance it.
You're gonna miss the super Phil Tedlock here. The humility is rare. Most companies want to just build a commercial organization, build a sales team, and be, the CEO of pharmaceutics, essentially, right? That's the golden.
Which was sold.
Yeah, right, exactly. Okay. I'm curious. In the 4-drug portfolio, normally you'd probably only see one if you're lucky. Work.
Right.
Your ability to forecast, because you're going to miss it, but we're talking about forecasting the whole day. Oh, by the way, I put up, when you talk about partnerships, this is awkward for you to say, but I can talk about the PI3K partnerships in the space are 2 to 4x your market cap today.
I know.
And those were for crappier drugs earlier stage.
Right.
So anyway, it's just a good frame of reference. But I wanted to ask you, when at my second fund, I was with a PhD, and he said an expert's ability to predict the outcome of a trial is equal to the dart-throwing chimpanzee,
exactly.
Right? You just said, I think we're going to have 2, potential candidates, right? So like, how do you really think it's a 25% probability, or do you really think it's a 50, 75? Like, and what gives you that confidence? How do you get to that confidence
Well, again, I think in our particular situation, a lot of it is by our experience, and a lot of it is by, like Bob, as you introduced Bob. When we start to develop an asset, we try and look at where it fits today, but where it will fit in the bigger scheme of things. And then we set a very high bar for ourselves of what we accept as evidence and accept as useful. I mean, in the case of 401, our kinase inhibitor, we could have just said, we want to be fourth in market. We'll take, whatever that market is, we're happy to take 10%, 20% of it. But that isn't what we want to do. We wanted to either be the best, or we weren't going to put money, because as you said, the resources are limited, so you have to make choices. So we put a very high bar, and every time the data started coming in, we raised the bar, and the drug just kept jumping over it. So that's why we're very confident.
And that's very rare in our experience. And I've been fooled, and I've made some mistakes in the past. I'll fess up to my mistakes later. But most small cap CEOs love their job. They love being in La Jolla, and frankly, they want to keep the thing going, even if the data is not that convincing. Right. Which I think is also this is why I keep telling investors you're the most interesting biotech I've found in this space, in the nano cap world. Because you're willing to actually kill something if it's not like 10x better, kind of, order of magnitude, not like 30% better. I mean, okay, if we're talking, hazard ratios, of course, you can't have.
I think everybody, we're all humans, and our impulse is to fall in love with what we're in love with, right? And so we have a drug, we see the data, we think, God, this is great, and we don't want to give up. And when we hit a hurdle, we say, oh yeah, well, we can fix that. But sometimes you just have to be honest and say, yeah, the odds are caught up with you, and it's time to move on.
It needs to be significantly better for you to find a partner and commercialize
right,
this.
because it is huge investments. I mean, they start out small, but they get big very quickly.
Although speaking of that, I mean, you've actually been quite efficient.
We've been efficient, right?
in your not only just raising capital, but just like spending as little as possible to get the so in the old days they would you would do a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Dan is just stretching and phase 1 is just to make sure it's safe. And Dan is stretching that safety trial into an efficacy trial because it's cheaper and faster, which is very rare. It's a little bit, it's slightly riskier because that trial might not count for registration or for partnering, but you get to the answer much more quickly and much more efficiently with less money, essentially.
Yeah.
And you just keep expanding, right?
Okay, I'll paraphrase for the video and the people on the webcast. What is the top thing preventing you from being the best performing biotech stock? And essentially, what is the biggest hurdle for you right now?
Yeah, I mean, for right now, it's all about execution. I mean, I have to say, as a CEO of a company, I'm a scientist by training, and as CEO of a company, it's remarkable how easy it is to see why drugs have failed. Because there's so many different aspects of, did the drug fall off the cart when it was being shipped to this clinical? You can't imagine how many places things can go wrong. So right now, we're in the stage where it's all about execution. We're running a registration study. It should be done in a year and a half, and we can't let the ball drop on this one. And so that's where we focus all our energies, and that's what keeps me up at night, is to make sure the team's doing what they're supposed to do. And if that works, I mean, there's no question we have a winning drug. I mean, I think everybody agrees to that. It's just making sure that you finish the trial.
Well, the market doesn't agree with that.
The market doesn't agree. Well, yeah. So this is an interesting case, I have to say, just very quickly. This is a class of drugs which was going head-to-head with Bob Duggan in pharmaceutics.
Yes.
The pharmaceutics drug is a different class of drugs than the drug we're developing. But in fact, if all things were equal, our class of drugs is more important than BTK, to give you an idea of how big it could potentially be. The problem with this class of drugs has always been toxicity, and I think that list of a couple of these companies that you have on here, they've developed these drugs, and they're actually approved, but nobody uses them, and because their toxicity profiles are significant. And so people say to us, wow, you guys have the best drug in class, but does anybody care about the class? And so it's our job is to continually educate people, like, I understand that's history, but now we're going to write a new chapter, and we're going to show you why this isn't your mom's old drug. This is a new drug that doesn't have the toxicity problem. That was the highest hurdle we raised for ourselves, is to prove that.
And not just this drug, not just this class, it's that you have other class drugs coming in to treat CLL and other indications that maybe limits that commercial bang, even though in CLL you have 100% response rate.
Right.
So you're better than what's getting approved right now. Well, technically, I mean, it's 11 patients, so it's not, yeah. You're more than 11, this is probably old, huh?
Yeah. I think the last presentation we had 15 out of 15.
Okay, but 15.
Anyway,
yeah, but if it's 100% response rate, this should be in the market for CLL.
You would think, right. So this is another example of the difficulty of developing drugs. We call it trying to find the white space. Because CLL used to be a disease, it's chronic lymphocytic leukemia. It's one of the most common adult leukemias. And there was really nothing for it. There's chemotherapy, and that was about it. And now there's a lot of really effective drugs, and so people are living a lot longer. And so you're trying to figure out strategically, where do you get your foot in? And let me tell you, I'm looking at this data, and I've got 100% response rates, better than any drug that's being used in the industry. And we can't figure out the white space right now. And we're fighting AbbVie. I mean, that's the issue. We're a small company, and AbbVie is the 600-pound gorilla in the room, where we're trying to figure out how to navigate around that.
Travis, you want to?
Yeah, because that was my question. I just want a quick follow-up on that. I'm curious, does the market cap and the stock being down affect your ability to affect partnerships? Because obviously it affects your ability to raise a certain amount of capital in the public markets, but does it change the conversation?
Yeah, so the answer is no, because I can tell you that we've always had an open dialogue with strategics. That's pharma, or partner. And they're a lot smarter than, in some ways, than investors. Not that you guys aren't smart. They look at things differently. And so for them, they don't care what the market cap is. They want to know that your drug works, because for them, the business development guy who pulls the trigger and says we want to license this drug, it's his neck on the line or her neck on the line at that point. And so their diligence is very, very different than the investor diligence.
Can I caveat? I think you will disagree or agree. It does that you need to demonstrate the ability to do this on your own.
Yeah, I think
otherwise you're not gonna. They're gonna know you have to do this.
That's exactly right. You have to be able to look them in the eye and walk. Know that they have to know you'll walk away if they try and lowball you. The bigger issue that we deal with at this particular market cap is when you're talking to a strategic. I mean, they're not dumb. They look at you and they say, "Well, why should I give you $100 million up front, to have the opportunity to work with your drug when I could take you out for not much more?" And so that's an issue for us, because we would think that's a way too cheap a price. And so how we balance that is challenging. I mean, everybody should be in that position. But.
Look, we've gotten we've gotten taken out of our most successful biotech. We were taken out, and actually the drug ended up. It was Aztecs and SGI 110, which was going after the same space as Presinistat.
Right.
Ended up being nothing.
Nothing. Yeah.
So if you get a decent offer, maybe take it. I think with that said, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you all.
Thanks for being.